You broke our rules!
No. You invented them.
Malik Osei signed the closing papers on the corner lot house on Heron Point Lane on a bright Tuesday morning in early spring, his hand steady despite having come straight from a 12-hour overnight shift in the emergency department, still wearing his hospital lanyard because he hadn't wanted to waste a single minute changing before the appointment. I was 29 years old, and the house represented 6 years of double shifts, skipped vacations, and a savings account. He had guarded more carefully than almost anything else in his life. All of it building toward a single promise he had made to himself the year he graduated nursing school. That one day he would put a house in his mother's name to visit, whenever she wanted a quiet corner lot with a wraparound porch and a clear view down toward the creek. The kind of home neither of them had ever imagined growing up in a two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. When the realtor handed him the keys, Malik held them for a long moment before closing his fist around them, and he called his mother from the driveway, telling her simply, "It's done. It's really done," and hearing her cry on the other end of the line in a way that made the exhaustion of the overnight shift disappear entirely. He moved in over the following weekend with help from 2 coworkers from Ash Grove Memorial's emergency department, and within his first 2 weeks in Cedar Hollow Estates, he had settled into the rhythm that had defined his entire nursing career, working overnight shifts that ran from 7 in the evening until 7 the next morning. Sleeping through the daylight hours behind blackout curtains, he installed the very first weekend and waking in the late afternoon to eat dinner alone before driving back to the hospital as the sun went down. It was an unremarkable schedule, the same one thousands of nurses across the country kept every single night, but in a neighborhood where most residents left for work at 8 in the morning and returned home by 6 in the evening. Malik's rhythm made him visible in ways he hadn't anticipated. His car pulling into the driveway at dawn, in wrinkled scrubs, his porch light glowing at hours when every other house on the street sat dark. He noticed the glances before he ever received a single official complaint. An older woman 2 doors down who stopped mid-stride while walking her dog one morning and watched him a beat too long as he climbed out of his car at 6:15. A man across the street who mentioned to a neighbor in a tone Malik happened to overhear from his own front yard that he wasn't sure what to make of the new guy's hours. Malik had grown up understanding in the quiet, practical way black men often learn early and never fully forget that unfamiliar routines read differently on him than they would on someone else. And he told himself, standing in his own driveway, in his own scrubs, holding his own hospital badge, that it would pass once people got used to seeing him around. It did not pass. 9 days after he moved in, a bright orange notice appeared zip-tied to his front door, and he read it standing on his own porch in the gray hour before sunrise. Excessive nighttime noise disturbance. Multiple reported incidents, violation of Cedar Hollow Estates, quiet hours provisions fine of $200 per incident. Malik stood very still, reading it twice, running back through his memory of the past 2 weeks, certain he had been at the hospital sitting at a nurse's station or standing over a patient's bed during every single hour the notice described. He called the HOA management office as soon as it opened and reached an administrative assistant named Priya, who read him 3 separate complaint entries, each describing loud music and slamming doors between 11 at night and 3 in the morning on dates. Malik knew with total certainty he had spent inside Ash Grove Memorial's emergency department. "I wasn't home," Malik told her, keeping his voice level in the same controlled tone he used when explaining a difficult diagnosis to a frightened family member. "I was at work. I can prove it if I need to. Who filed these?" "I'm not able to share the reporting party's identity," Priya said, and then almost apologetically added, "but I can tell you all 3 came from the same household." Malik thanked her and hung up, and he sat with that detail the way he sat with an unusual lab result on a chart, a small anomaly that told him nothing definitive on its own, but suggested a pattern worth watching closely. The pattern sharpened 4 days later with a second notice, this one accusing him of suspicious activity and unauthorized nighttime visitors, describing an unfamiliar vehicle in his driveway during late hours, and an unidentified individual entering and exiting his home after midnight. Malik read the description of the vehicle, a gray sedan with a hospital parking permit clearly visible on the dashboard, and recognized it instantly as belonging to his coworker Reggie, who had dropped off a forgotten laptop charger one night before Malik's shift. The unidentified individual entering after midnight was Malik himself, arriving home from work at his own house. Someone was not simply annoyed by unfamiliar hours. Someone was cataloging his comings and goings closely enough to note vehicle details, and doing it with the specific intention of making an ordinary night shift nurse look suspicious. He learned the shape of that someone at a community welcome mixer held on the clubhouse lawn, a week later, an event he attended mostly out of a wish to be a good neighbor, where he was introduced to Deborah Kessler, the president of the Cedar Hollow Estates Homeowners Association, a woman in her early 50s with a sharply styled blonde bob and a confident, performative smile, who shook his hand a beat too firmly and said in a tone that struck him as strange, even before he understood why, "We're so glad someone finally bought that corner lot. It's had such potential sitting empty all those months before you came along." Malik thanked her, said nothing more, and filed the comment away without fully understanding yet how much weight it would eventually carry. He spent the rest of the mixer making polite conversation with a handful of other residents, most of them friendly enough. A retired school teacher who asked about his work at the hospital with genuine curiosity, a young couple with a toddler who mentioned they'd only moved in the year before and still felt like newcomers themselves. It was on the surface an ordinary neighborhood gathering, folding tables covered in potato salad and lemonade, children chasing each other across the lawn while their parents talked in small clusters. But Malik noticed, in the careful, practiced way he noticed vital signs on a monitor, the particular way certain conversations shifted or thinned out when he approached, not hostile exactly, but not entirely warm either, a subtle recalibration he had felt often enough in his life to recognize without needing anyone to say a word. Deborah found him again near the end of the evening, refilling her lemonade at the drink table, and asked with the same bright smile whether he lived alone in the house. And when Malik said yes, she nodded slowly and said, "That's a lot of house for one person. You'll have to tell me what you're planning to do with all that space." A comment that felt, even in the moment, less like idle small talk and more like an inventory being taken. I understood it better 3 weeks later when a third notice arrived, this one citing Section 14B of the community bylaws, the Nighttime Activity and Quiet Preservation Ordinance, quoted at length in language that felt oddly specific, describing restrictions on nighttime vehicle traffic and what it called irregular occupancy patterns inconsistent with the residential character of the community. Malik pulled out the Homeowners Association handbook he had received at closing, paging through it slowly from cover to cover. Section 14 existed, covering ordinary noise complaints in broad language. There was no Section 14B anywhere in the document he had signed and agreed to when he bought the house. That discovery sat differently with Malik than the earlier notices, had less like confusion and more like the particular focused clarity he felt in the emergency department when a patient's symptoms finally lined up into a diagnosis he recognized. He sat at his kitchen table with the 3 notices spread in front of him, and rather than let the anger build unproductively, he did what a decade of emergency nursing had trained him to do with any crisis. He began gathering data before deciding on a course of action. He requested his official attendance records from Ash Grove Memorial's Human Resources Department, badge swipe timestamps, precise to the minute, documenting his exact arrival and departure for every shift over the preceding 2 months. The records arrived within days on hospital letterhead, placing him firmly inside the emergency department during every single hour described in the HOA complaints. Mod 3 copies filed, one in a folder on his kitchen counter, mailed one to his own address, unopened as a dated postal record, and kept the third in his car. He also began carefully, and without drawing attention to it, talking to a few neighbors he trusted, which was how he came to know Walter Higgins, a retired county records clerk in his early 70s, who lived 4 houses down and had lived in Cedar Hollow Estates for over 20 years. Malik had helped Walter's late wife during a brief emergency department visit the year before, and Walter remembered him warmly inviting him in for coffee one afternoon when Malik mentioned carefully and without much detail that he'd been receiving some unusual violation notices. "Read me the exact wording again," Walter said, setting down his coffee cup when Malik mentioned Section 14B. "I keep every newsletter and every set of minutes this association has ever put out. Old habit. Give me a day." What Walter found laid out across his kitchen table 2 days later confirmed what Malik had already begun to suspect. The bylaws amendment record, which every association was legally required to maintain, showed no vote, no meeting minutes, and no resident notification for anything resembling Section 14B at any point in the community's 22-year history. "This doesn't exist," Walter said flatly, tapping the empty space in the amendment log where a legitimate addition would have been recorded. "Somebody wrote this rule, printed it onto a notice, and started fining you under it. That's not an oversight, that's a decision." Rather than simply hold on to that discovery quietly, Malik decided to force the issue into the open. With Walter's help, he drafted a formal written request to the management company, citing the association's own bylaws requirement that any amendment be supported by documented meeting minutes and a recorded vote, and demanding the specific date and vote tally that had authorized Section 14B. He sent it by certified mail, keeping a copy of the receipt. The response came back 11 days later from Priya, vague and evasive, stating only that the section had been added under the current board's authority to update community standards, and that specific meeting minutes were being located. No date, no vote count. Malik read the letter twice and felt something settle into place. The same feeling he got when a vague chart note told him almost as much through what it avoided saying as what it actually said. I decided the response deserved more than a private filing. Over the following 2 weeks, he began quietly reaching out to other residents, starting with Frank and Loretta Simmons, an older couple, 2 streets over, who mentioned once Malik asked directly that they'd received a puzzling landscaping violation months earlier, despite having maintained their yard meticulously for over a decade. He found a third resident, a young teacher named Priya Chandran, who had been fined for what the notice called unauthorized vehicle storage over a car belonging to her visiting brother. Malik set up a small private group chat, inviting each of them to share their notices, their payment records, and their dates, building what he thought of in the same organized way he built a patient's case history as a shared timeline rather than 3 separate isolated complaints. Through Marla Fenton, a part-time bookkeeper who did work for several small local businesses and who Malik knew through a mutual friend at the hospital, the picture sharpened further. Marla had recently taken on a new client, a real estate investment firm run by a woman named Carla Whitfield, and she mentioned to Malik almost in passing over lunch that something about the account had struck her as strange. Recurring payments, labeled acquisition consulting, made out to Deborah Kessler personally alongside internal notes referencing something called the Heron Point opportunity. I can pull the invoices, Marla told him, her voice quieter than usual. I don't love what I think I'm about to find. What she found 2 days later described Malik's address directly in at least 3 separate memos, and one note in particular dated just before the first noise complaint had ever appeared on his door read, "Current owner presents low resistance profile due to work schedule and isolation." Escalating compliance pressure through the association should produce a lien-eligible delinquency within 90 days, opening the property for below-market acquisition through the association's foreclosure assistance program. Malik read the sentence sitting alone in his kitchen before an overnight shift, and he felt the same steady, focused resolve he felt whenever a case took a serious turn in the emergency department, a shift from confusion into clarity, from reacting into planning. I was not the accidental target of an overzealous board. I was the deliberate target of a scheme built specifically around his schedule, his isolation, and as he was about to discover assumptions about who he was that had nothing to do with either. He called Walter that same evening and read him the memo over the phone, and there was a long pause before Walter spoke, his voice grave in a way Malik hadn't heard from him before. "That's not an HOA dispute anymore, son," Walter said. "That's fraud, plain and simple, and it's the kind of thing that gets written up in a courtroom, not settled over coffee. You need more than me and my binders now." "I know," Malik said, "but I want to be sure before I bring in a lawyer. I want to know exactly what she thinks about me, not just what she's doing to me." Walter was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened. "I've lived in this neighborhood over 20 years, he said. "Watched a lot of people move in and out. Most of them nobody ever asked twice about their comings and goings. I want you to have whatever proof you need, but I also want you to know whatever happens with the paperwork, you didn't imagine any of this. I saw the way some of these folks looked at you at that mixer. You weren't wrong to notice it." Walter was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about drawing her out. I'm talking about asking her a question polite enough that she can't refuse to answer it," Malik said, and hoping she answers it honestly enough to hang herself with her own words. He decided to test that suspicion directly, rather than simply wait for more evidence to surface on its own. He drafted a short, carefully worded email to Deborah Kessler, polite and measured, asking plainly why his property had continued to receive violation notices under a section of the bylaws that appeared nowhere in the association's official amendment record, and whether she could clarify what specifically about his household had drawn repeated scrutiny compared to others on the street. He read the email aloud to Walter over the phone before sending it, and Walter told him it struck exactly the right tone, calm enough to invite a real response, direct enough to make evasion difficult. Deborah's reply arrived the next morning, longer than Malik expected, defensive in tone, insisting the association retained full discretion to enforce community standards. But buried in the third paragraph, in language she likely believed sounded reasonable. She wrote that several residents had expressed concern about irregular comings and goings at odd hours, and that the board had a responsibility to maintain the image and character the neighborhood has always represented, adding that she personally felt his household didn't quite fit the profile of the community when she'd first learned who had purchased the corner lot. Malik read the email twice, then forwarded it immediately to Walter and printed a copy for his growing file. It was the clearest evidence yet that the enforcement against him had never been about noise or vehicles at all. He didn't stop there. A few days later, an anonymous post appeared in the Cedar Hollow Estates community Facebook group written by a resident who described, without naming names, receiving repeated violation notices for a rule that appeared nowhere in the official bylaws and asking whether anyone else had experienced something similar. Malik hadn't written it himself, but Walter had at Malik's quiet suggestion, and within 2 days the post had accumulated dozens of comments from residents describing their own confusing run-ins with the board over the preceding year, several specifically mentioning Deborah by name. Reggie, Malik's co-worker from the emergency department, noticed how quiet Malik had grown over those weeks and finally asked him directly, one slow night on shift, the two of them restocking a supply cart between patients. "You've been somewhere else in your head lately," Reggie said. "Everything all right at the new place?" Malik hesitated, then gave him the short version, the notices, the fake bylaws section, the email. Reggie let out a low whistle. "That's wild. You want backup? I'll write a statement about the charger if it helps." "It might," Malik said. "I'm trying to make sure none of this comes down to my word against hers. I want it to come down to dates and signatures." By the time Malik sat down with attorney Ines Alvarado, a housing and consumer protection lawyer, Walter's niece had recommended he brought a file considerably more complete than the one he'd started with weeks earlier. Hospital attendance records, the non-existent bylaws amendment, Carla Whitfield's internal memos, Deborah's own email revealing her bias, and a growing group of neighbors willing to speak. Hines went through it slowly, her expression shifting from professional attentiveness into something sharper. "This isn't just a bad HOA president," she said, finally setting down the last page. "This is fraudulent amendment of governing documents, discriminatory selective enforcement, breach of fiduciary duty, and very possibly conspiracy, given what Whitfield wrote in her own memo. We're not just going to respond to this, Malik. We're going to get ahead of it." That shift in strategy became the defining difference in how the second half of the story unfolded. Rather than wait for the association to make its next move, Ines filed a civil complaint on Malik's behalf, and in the same filing requested an emergency court order, freezing any transfer or sale proceedings related to his property, a preemptive strike designed specifically to shut down the foreclosure assistance sale mechanism before Deborah could ever set it in motion. The order was granted within 4 days, quietly without public announcement, a legal wall now standing between Deborah's plan and its execution before she even realized her timeline had collapsed. Word of the group chat, the anonymous post, and Malik's certified letter had already been circulating through Cedar Hollow Estates by the time the next scheduled board meeting arrived and the clubhouse filled well past capacity. Residents standing along the back wall, folding chairs pulled in from the storage closet to accommodate the crowd. Malik arrived early with Ines, Walter, and a thick folder under his arm, and he took a seat near the front, close enough to the board table that Deborah couldn't avoid seeing him the moment she walked in. She arrived a few minutes later, composed and polished as always, greeting a few residents near the door with her usual bright smile before taking her seat at the head table, and Malik watched her scan the unusually full room, her expression flickering for just a moment before settling back into practiced calm. Deborah opened the meeting with her usual brisk confidence, moving quickly through routine items, the pool maintenance budget and upcoming landscaping contract renewal, clearly hoping to reach adjournment before anything unplanned could surface. When she called for open comments, glancing at the clock as though hoping to rush through the formality, Malik stood. "Before I say anything," he said, his voice calm and even the same tone he used delivering difficult news at a patient's bedside. "I'd like the board to confirm this meeting is being recorded since residents are entitled to a public record of these proceedings." Terrence Boyd, the vice president, glanced at Deborah, who hesitated a beat too long before agreeing, and a resident near the front raised a phone recording openly from that point forward. Malik noticed the small shift in Deborah's posture, her shoulders squaring slightly, the practiced smile tightening at the edges. "Go ahead, Mr. Osei," Deborah said, folding her hands in front of her on the table. "Though I'll remind everyone we have a full agenda tonight." "This won't take long," Malik said. "I just want the record to be complete." He laid out his case in the same structured order he'd built it first, reading the exact wording of his violation notices aloud, pausing after each one to let the room absorb the specificity of the accusations. Then the sections of the handbook that contain no such ordinance, holding up the actual booklet so residents could see its thinness compared to the elaborate rule being enforced against him. He read Walter's documentation showing no vote had ever authorized Section 14B, and Walter, seated beside him, nodded once when Malik gestured toward him, confirming the research without needing to speak. On every single date listed in these complaints, Malik continued, holding up the hospital printout, I was clocked in at Ash Grove Memorial's emergency department. Not near my house. Not in the neighborhood at all. I have the timestamps down to the minute, and I'm happy to submit copies to this board tonight. A murmur moved through the room. Deborah's jaw tightened, but she said nothing yet. I also want to read something else, Malik said and paused, looking directly at Deborah across the room. This is an email I received 12 days ago in response to a question I asked about why my household kept receiving notices under a rule that doesn't exist in this association's official records. He read the line aloud slowly, giving each word room to land. I personally felt his household didn't quite fit the profile of the community when I first learned who had purchased the corner lot. The room went completely silent. Somewhere near the back, a chair creaked as someone shifted their weight. Deborah's composure cracked visibly, her face working through several expressions before she managed. That comment was taken out of context. I was referring to occupancy patterns, not... She stopped herself, seeming to hear how the sentence would end before she finished saying it. There isn't much context that changes what it says, Malik said without raising his voice. This is a private communication, Deborah said, her tone sharpening. You had no right to read it aloud in a public meeting. You sent it in response to a question about association business, Ines said, standing from her seat beside Malik and addressing the board directly for the first time. I'm Inez Alvarado, legal counsel for Mr. Osei. That email is relevant to matters this board is legally obligated to address tonight, and it will be entered as an exhibit regardless of where it's read aloud. Deborah's eyes moved to Inez, then back to Malik, then briefly involuntarily toward the door, as though calculating whether the meeting could still somehow be adjourned before anything further came out. I'd also like to inform the board, Inez continued, her voice measured and professional, that a civil complaint has already been filed on Mr. Osei's behalf and that an emergency court order has already been granted freezing any transaction involving his property effective as of 4 days ago. Whatever plan may have existed to force a sale through manufactured delinquency is no longer legally possible to execute. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd, residents turning to whisper to one another, trying to piece together the shape of what was being described. I'd also like to formally request, Ines added, turning toward the board table, that the association commission an independent audit of its financial records tonight, beginning with any payments made to Ms. Kessler personally from outside entities, given documentation we have showing a financial relationship with a real estate investment firm that specifically discussed acquiring this property by name. This is absurd, Deborah said, her voice rising for the first time. I have served this community faithfully for 18 months, and I will not sit here and be accused of... Deborah, Terrence Boyd said quietly, cutting her off, and something in his tone made her stop. Just answer the question. Have you received any payments from Carla Whitfield's firm? The silence that followed lasted long enough that several people in the crowd began murmuring again before Deborah finally said stiffly, I've provided informal market consulting. That's not against any rule. Was that consulting relationship disclosed to this board? Terrence asked. Deborah didn't answer. Frank Simmons stood before the silence stretched any further, his voice shaking slightly with the particular anger of a man who had spent 30 years quietly maintaining his property only to be accused of neglecting it. I got fined for landscaping I've kept the same way for over a decade, he said. Nobody ever explained why, and when I asked, I got the same runaround Malik's describing. Loretta stood beside him. We paid nearly $300 before we decided to stop being quiet about it. Priya Chandran followed, describing her own fine over her brother's visiting car, her voice steadier than she'd expected once she saw how many neighbors were nodding along in recognition. How many people in this room, Malik asked, turning to face the crowd rather than the board, have gotten a notice in the last year that didn't quite make sense, something that felt more like a guess than an actual rule? More than a dozen hands went up, scattered across the room, some tentative, some raised without hesitation. Deborah looked out at the raised hands, and for the first time all evening, something in her expression shifted from defensive irritation into something closer to genuine alarm. It was Terrence Boyd who moved next, standing from his seat at the board table with the look of a man who had spent the past year quietly uneasy and had finally run out of reasons to stay silent. "I move," he said, "that we suspend Deborah Kessler's presidency effective immediately pending the outcome of this investigation." The motion was seconded within seconds by another board member who had clearly been waiting for permission to break from Deborah's leadership. Deborah tried once more to regain control, declaring the accusations unsubstantiated and demanding time to consult her own attorney before any vote was taken. But when she moved to adjourn the meeting entirely, rather than allow a vote, Terrence refused to second it, stating plainly that residents deserved a full accounting first. "There's one more thing," Malik said before the vote on Deborah's suspension was called. "Under Article 9 of the association bylaws, residents have the right to initiate a recall vote against any sitting board member with sufficient signatures present at a meeting. I have that number tonight." He held up a folded sheet of paper, the signatures Walter had quietly helped him gather over the preceding week, going door to door in the evenings before Malik's shifts. "I'd like to formally submit it." A murmur moved through the crowd. Deborah opened her mouth to object, but Inez spoke first, her tone even and professional. "That's a valid procedural request under your own governing documents, Ms. Kessler. The same documents you've spent the last several weeks citing against Mr. Osei." Deborah looked around the room at the raised phone still recording, at Terrence's steady, unwavering expression, at the dozen raised hands still visible among the crowd, and seemed for the first time that evening to understand that there was no version of the meeting left in which she retained control of the outcome. The recall vote and the suspension motion passed together by an overwhelming margin, with only one board member voting against either. Deborah gathered her papers in silence, her hands moving with none of the brisk confidence she'd carried into the room, and left the clubhouse. The sound of the door swinging shut behind her, the only noise in a room that had gone almost entirely quiet. For a moment after she left, no one spoke. Then Loretta Simmons let out a long breath and said to no one in particular, "Well, I did not expect that when I got dressed tonight." And a ripple of tired, relieved laughter moved through the crowd, the kind of laughter that comes only after a held breath is finally released. The independent audit conducted over the following weeks by an accountant, the reconstituted board hired at Terrence's insistence, confirmed everything Malik's file had already suggested. Section 14B had been fabricated entirely by Deborah, added to notice templates without board authorization. She had used her position to selectively enforce it against Malik, while quietly steering the association's foreclosure assistance list toward properties that would benefit Carla Whitfield's investment firm, with at least one other targeted property identified before the scheme was uncovered. A modest starter home 2 streets over, belonging to a young couple who had not yet received a single violation notice, but whose address appeared in the same memo file as Malik's. Investigators from the state's Consumer Protection Division, working from the complaint Inez had filed, subpoenaed the full communication history between Deborah and Carla Whitfield, uncovering a string of text messages spanning nearly 6 months that laid out the arrangement in increasingly explicit terms. In one exchange dated shortly after Malik's closing date became public record through the county assessor's office, Carla had written simply, "Corner lot finally sold. Perfect timing. Let's talk strategy." To which Deborah had replied, "Give me 60 days. I know exactly how to handle this." Carla Whitfield, when contacted by investigators, attempted initially to describe the arrangement as routine market research, an explanation that collapsed under the plain language of her own memo describing Malik's low-resistance profile. Her attorney advised her to settle quickly once the state indicated it intended to pursue the case as a coordinated scheme rather than isolated poor judgment, and she ultimately agreed to pay restitution, cover a portion of the investigation's costs, and permanently withdraw any interest in Cedar Hollow Estates properties, along with a 5-year prohibition on acquiring residential property through any homeowners association foreclosure assistance program in the state. The civil suit filed on behalf of Malik the Simmonses and Priya Chandran proceeded to a settlement several months later after depositions, in which Deborah, under oath, struggled repeatedly to explain the origin of Section 14B, eventually admitting she had drafted the language herself after finding a similar provision used by another homeowners association online. Believing, as she put it in a moment, Inez would later describe as the closest thing to a confession the case ever produced, that boards update their own rules all the time, and nobody usually asks to see the paperwork. "Somebody asked this time," Inez had replied, and moved on to the next question. Deborah agreed to pay full restitution for every fine collected under the fraudulent ordinance, cover the plaintiff's legal fees, and permanently relinquish any future role on the board, along with a formal written acknowledgement that Section 14B had never been legitimately enacted. The discriminatory nature of her enforcement, documented plainly in her own email, meant the settlement also included specific findings under the Fair Housing Act. A detail Ines noted would follow Deborah in any future attempt to serve on a homeowners board anywhere in the state, since such findings were required to be disclosed in any future association election filing. At the next meeting, held under Terrence Boyd's leadership, held in the same clubhouse room, but with the folding chairs arranged in a loose semicircle rather than facing a raised head table, the board read aloud a full corrected version of the bylaws and passed a new provision requiring any nighttime disturbance complaint to be cross-checked against publicly available work schedule documentation before a fine could be issued, a rule that residents began referring to without much discussion needed as Malik's provision. A second reform required any proposed bylaws amendment to be posted publicly for 30 days with a recorded vote before taking effect, and a third established an independent compliance review committee modeled loosely on a similar proposal Malik had mentioned in passing to Terrence weeks earlier, made up of rotating resident volunteers rather than board appointees alone. Frank and Loretta Simmons were among the first to volunteer for the new committee, joking that after decades of unexplained landscaping fines, they finally wanted a say in how such things were decided. Priya Chandran joined as well, bringing the same careful, detail-oriented habits she used grading student essays to the task of reviewing violation notices for consistency and fairness. Walter, though, he declined an official seat citing his age and his preference for staying out of the spotlight, continued quietly maintaining his archive, telling Malik once over coffee that he suspected the neighborhood would need someone keeping careful records again eventually, and he intended to be ready. Malik continued working his overnight shifts at Ash Grove Memorial exactly as he always had, sitting with patients through difficult nights, running codes when they came, documenting everything with the same careful precision that had ultimately unraveled Deborah's scheme. When a reporter from a regional paper reached out weeks later, hoping to write about the case, having heard about it through the county court filings, he agreed to a short interview but kept his answer simple. "I didn't do anything unusual," he told her, sitting on his own front porch in the late afternoon light before an evening shift. "I documented everything the same way I document a patient's chart, and I let the paperwork speak for itself. People don't have to believe you if you're loud. They have a much harder time arguing with a record." The reporter asked whether he'd felt afraid at any point during the process, targeted the way he had been, and Malik considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Every night at work, I see people show up scared, not knowing what's about to happen to them," he said. "Part of the job is learning how to stay calm enough to actually help even when you're scared too. I think I just applied the same habit to my own life for a few months. It's not that I wasn't afraid, it's that I decided being afraid wasn't going to stop me from writing everything down." Reggie stopped by one evening not long after the settlement closed, dropping off a six-pack and sitting with Malik on the porch steps while the sun went down over the ravine, the same view that had first drawn Malik to the house months earlier. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't caught that fake rule?" Reggie asked. Malik thought about it, turning the question over, the way he turned over difficult cases in his mind long after a shift ended. "I think about it," he admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it too long. What matters is I did catch it, and now there's a whole committee making sure the next person doesn't have to catch it alone." He hung a small brass plate beside his front door not long after the settlement closed, a housewarming gift his mother had given him the week he moved in and never had the chance to put up properly during the months of notices and fines, engraved simply with their shared last name, Osei. His mother visited for the first time since the whole ordeal had ended on a warm Saturday afternoon, and Malik gave her the full tour of the house she had only seen in photographs before ending on the front porch, where the plate now caught the late afternoon light. "You did all this on your own?" she asked, running her fingers lightly over the engraved letters. "Not entirely on my own," Malik said, thinking of Walter's binders. Ines's steady legal strategy, Marla's willingness to risk a client relationship for the truth, Frank and Loretta and Priya standing up in a crowded room to say their own stories out loud. "But I made sure nobody could take it from us without a fight." His mother smiled, the same smile Malik remembered from childhood evenings in their old apartment above the laundromat, and looked out over the quiet street, the ravine, the creek visible in the distance beyond the yard. "Your grandmother used to say the same thing," she said. "Write it down. Keep the receipt. People can lie all they want, but paper doesn't change its story." Beneath his porch light in the quiet hours before his next shift, Malik stood for a moment looking at the brass plate before heading out to his car, The corner lot finally fully undeniably his own, and somewhere down the street in a house he no longer drove past. Without a small, quiet satisfaction, a for sale sign stood in Deborah Kessler's front yard. The velvet confidence she had once carried through every meeting long since packed away along with the rest of her belongings.